Good morning. Thank you for staying. Well done. It's actually a case of body in Edinburgh, brain in Sydney, so cut me some slack. This is the plan. I'm going to set the scene, talk generally about transformational change. Rail is a great example of that, and here I will be getting sort of Chris at some stage to walk up and take you through the detail of the process, including some great pictures of some trains. And we're running this in sequence, so it will be a bit of interaction between the two of us. It will include that, I can assure you. So I'm going to start with a straw poll. This is just a hands up. Just straight, do you particularly like change? So hands up if you particularly like change. And that's not bad. Now I'm going to ask you the opposite question. Do you particularly dislike change? And we have that mixed crowd. Okay, well, the thesis here is really that if change on the outside is faster than change on the inside of an organization, you might be in trouble. And that's the theme I'm going to take you on to discuss. So the origins here came from Taz Watson working on transformational change, and in particular, some very heavy-duty, what you might call sort of governance on steroids types of processes, including what we call the client that can't be named project for a sovereign wealth fund in Abu Dhabi. And both investment governance and investment content rank big in these types of processes. So you have to think of transformational change as far-reaching movement in people, obviously in structure, in strategy, and not least in culture. And most of these exercises have an ambition to really, as people say, move the needle, maybe double the effectiveness of an organization. Now, my sense is that transformational change processes will continue to get some traction, but many people are reluctant to commit because of the time and energy and the risk that the expectations won't live up to it. So Rail ran some risks. It was Chris and John Chilman who took a commitment here to make a difference to the organization, and to the credit of the organization, that was a career risk which they were prepared to take. Telling the story through a few numbers here. In fact, the process was started up around about 2 years ago. Leadership group of 5, Chris, Kieran Barr, Paul Bishop, Frank Johnson, Paul Trickett. 8 months of work initially, 23 steering committee meetings, 60 working papers, 422 actions, and it is a tale of adding together 1%. So Chris Brailsford, the Team GB cycling supremo, he had his team travel with their home pillows so that they could get that little edge from sleeping better. Now, the big 4 content points included in Rail: the value chain, essentially the manager lineup, how it's configured, and in particular, the value proposition in all the managers in that chain. Private markets, where approaches to exercise greater control are very common. Systematic and thematic approaches to investing, often referred to these days as smart beta, picking a path through internal executive control and skill, lower cost, less complex governance. And last but not least, allocating to risk as opposed to asset classes, and how that works in practice. So that's the sort of what of transformational change, but the important thing is that there's a big how component. And here, Rail actually came forward with, I think, several global firsts with the structures that they adopted, but in particular the investment committee, where the professional nature of that committee, the peer-to-peer relationship between the exec and the investment committee, and the idea that there can be a sort of 1 + 1 = more than 2 effect between a governing board and the executive team. So these were all, I think, very interesting features of that process. Now, the main reason for change is obvious. It's the potential for improved performance. But the relationship between better governance and better performance obviously has a lag. the evidence is really clear when you think about it that you are changing the way you do things at point T, and then maybe 2 quarters later you take that decision that is then going to impact the organization a year or 2 later. Think of it from that point of view. And so we actually have to be very careful about the models we use in relation to measuring this and keeping score on governance. And here I'm going to make reference to the Clark and Urwin framework model, which has become quite widely applied by very big asset owners across the world. Now, the nature of the model is there are 12 factors that drive superior performance. Fairly straightforward. And the nature here is that you're keeping the score on something that's extremely soft and squishy. But you can do that. It's difficult but doable. It's obviously a moving target. It's obviously difficult to be precise. But we measure what we do because we can, but we can measure more than what we do. This is an opportunity to use the mantra that measurement gives a subject respect. And in the context of Rail's change here, it was about moving them from quite a mediocre score up towards a world-class figure. And that is a multi-year effort. So this is 2 years into that process. So let me just take you into another dimension of this change issue is to do with how the industry is changing, you could say, on the outside, and that's generating the need for change on the inside. So change is clearly an accelerating force here. And if you think about the outside sources, we have all aspects of the new normal. We have issues from geopolitics. We have issues from the social and environmental agendas. And then we have how organizations respond to that. Now, the thesis I'm going to put forward is that basically incremental change is the asset owner's usual preference. But transformational change is happening to our industry all around us. And so transformational change may be necessary to get the results we want. So when change on the outside is faster than change on the inside, you're actually going to confront some problems. Now, Rail has a very inquisitive culture, so they dealt with the idea that they needed to be systematic about viewing the competitive nature of the landscape. And that leads you to take a little bit of an academic approach to this, and I'm going to advance this point about Porter's 5 forces. So it's almost the most famous model of business models generally is Porter's 5 forces of competition being disruptive. Porter's 5 forces. 3 along the horizontal, the 2 vertical, 1, the influence of suppliers and end customers, you could call them. Now, innovations in this field are sustainable, but they may be disruptive at the same time. And you have to think about the nature of these different types of innovations and changes. So let me just take you kind of around the clock face a little bit here. At 9 o'clock, the substitution opportunities from internalization. So basically, very big funds are doing more internally to control their outcomes. Rail is on that case. It has a bigger team to produce more of the impacts on their portfolio than they had in the past because they were very much relying on the outside managers for their results. At 12 o'clock, the value proposition from the asset managers, this is where this term value chain is really interesting. It's to do with the idea that not every manager mandate has an equivalent chance of adding value when you take into account cost and risk. So again, Rail's interesting proposition is around increases to the smart beta propositions in the portfolio and lesser reliance on traditional alpha management. And last but not least, the one right in the middle, and this is really very resonant for most organizations everywhere, that pension funds like Rail all critically need more like 4 or 5% real returns. And yet, when you think about what's out there from bulk betas, the equities and bonds that we have in our portfolios, you really are only reaching about 3% real. So in order to make that gap up, they have to draw fully on their investment talent, and that internal talent is increasingly where organizations of this size are going. In the past, they looked to the external firms for that talent. Increasingly, they're looking internally for that talent. Now, to be successful, you have to think about the challenge as being about the theory of comparative advantage. So it's not how good you are, it's actually how much better you are than those that you compete with, which is basically every investor out there. So in thinking about that, you have to be very confident in your own capabilities and accurate in the assessment of your own capabilities. Very good example is really how hedge funds might be used, that a fund of hedge funds wouldn't give the same comparative advantage if the organization is able to generate for themselves direct selection of hedge funds and or the use of smart betas in place of hedge funds. Very much a resonant theme from last year when organizations like CalPERS and PGGM took a route in that direction. So I'm going to just summarize this work on change in terms of the fact that change is happening in some very big funds in a very systematic way. I'm going to name CalPERS, I'm going to name PGGM, I'm going to name Tesco, interestingly, as organizations that have kind of grappled with their structure and made a difference to their affairs. I'm also going to mention that change is happening to smaller funds, particularly through the fiduciary management route. That's for another day. But change places different demands on you, and in particular, it demands that you use your softer skills. And in that area, we have the technical bits for success. We have all the investment methodologies for success. But what we need more of are some of these human bits, which is basically leadership, culture, and really quality of governance and process. And those are the ones that I think Rail have actually explored in the last 2 years. So I'm going to pass across to Chris to take you a bit further. Thank you so far.